You're listening to the Immersive Audio Album Podcast.
Please listen with headphones for the best spatial experience. Hey everyone, I'm Jonathan, head of music at Immersive Audio Album, and I'm here with our lead developer, Cameron. So this is the third episode of the IAA podcast, and of course we want to thank all our listeners who've tuned into the previous two episodes, and if you haven't, be sure to check those out. So on our last episode, we talked about listening to Dolby Atmos music on speakers, and we critiqued some of these mixes based on spatial placement and other factors. But one thing we touched on briefly is that how one of Atmos's most unique features is its ability to render as binaural on headphones. So the topic of this episode is going to be all about binaural audio and surround on headphones and how that process has evolved over time. So Cameron, what do you think about listening to spatial audio on headphones? How has the experience been for you?
Well, firstly, I'll start off by saying I feel like spatial audio sounds so much better than just regular stereo in the context of movies and in the context of video games, but also in the context of music. I've tried lots of different versions of spatial audio rendering. There's Windows spatial audio, there's Dolby Atmos for headphones, there's Apple's own proprietary spatial audio format that only works with like their AirPods and AirPods Max, I believe, and some of the new Beats headphones, all Apple headphones essentially. I've even tried some VR devices that can kind of do the tracking, the head tracking, and there was even a time where there were headphones that had these sensors that can do these. But let's get into it. Before we can talk about how all of these experiences differ, we should talk about how binaural audio actually works.
Yeah, I completely agree. So as I understand it, kind of the key to binaural, if you will, is something called a head-related transfer function, or typically the acronym they use is HRTF. And essentially what this is kind of like a measurement of what happens to a sound wave before it reaches your eardrum. So you think about when a sound wave is hitting your ear, whether it's you're wearing headphones or you're listening to speakers, the wave bounces off your shoulders, it bounces off the outside of your ear, it moves around your ear canal, and it touches all these different surfaces before it touches your eardrum. And every time the sound wave bounces off one of these surfaces, it causes like a slight variance in EQ. So sort of a clever way you can think about it is that each person kind of has their own built-in EQ curve. And the reason why this is important for binaural is because those slight variances in EQ are key for kind of tricking your ear into feeling like you're in a different space. Now, as for the term binaural itself, true binaural audio would be recorded using one of these like dummy head microphones. Like the most common one you might see is the Neumann KU100. And these binaural heads have the microphones inside of like a mold that's shaped like your ear. So the recording will have that built-in EQ variance when it bounces off the ear molding in the dummy head. And the idea of these binaural recordings is you can only listen to them on headphones, like it's a straight two-channel capture. Now, with Atmos, what's happening is they're taking a mix that was created on a speaker array and rendering it real-time into binaural. So it's technically, even though they use the term binaural, it's not really the same thing as a true binaural recording. And I find that the effect is interesting because you're obviously not gonna confuse it with listening to a real, 714 or 514 speaker system. But the effect, kind of like you were alluding to, it sounds deeper and wider than stereo. And it's interesting in its own right. But going back to another point you said before, the idea of trying to create the illusion of multi-channel on headphones is not a new idea. This is something that's been happening for decades, especially in the gaming world, more so than even in the film world and the music worlds.
Yeah, I remember that even before like Dolby Atmos for headphones, there were a lot of gaming headsets that like were advertised as support surround sound. I remember seeing like Turtle Beach headphones with 7.1. How did that work?
Yeah, exactly. So let's go back even further than that. So of course we're going to go back to the 70s with quadraphonic sound, which, as you know, is one of my favorite topics. Now, in the 70s, they actually made special headphones they called quadraphones. And literally the way these worked is that the old 4-channel receivers, like at my house in New York, I have an old Marantz 4070 amp. And it literally just has like 2 quarter-inch jacks, one for the front speakers and one for the rear. And the headphones literally just have 4 drivers in it. So there's this massive pair of headphones, and the left side has the left front and left rear speaker, and the right side has the right front and right rear speaker. And it has 2 quarter-inch plugs. So the difference between these processes and the new sort of Atmos binaural stuff is that there's no HRTF processing. There's nothing happening to convert the signal into binaural. Like, it's literally like you're just listening to a discrete 5.1 mix with the speakers very close together next to your ear. And at least from my own experience, it doesn't really work. Like, you can't perceive the front to back separation the same way you would on a real discrete speaker system.
Yeah, I remember trying those in store, and like they kept competing with each other by jamming more in. I do remember like they started with 5.1, and then they went from 7.1, and they had 9.1. And when you make so many speakers that small, I think they end up sounding really bad.
Exactly.
So how are these new binaural processes different from like those older products, like those cards that you put in your computer, like the Creative Sound Blaster? And like I remember having things like that, or even built into my motherboard on my PC, that had things like room equalizers. Yeah,
so you probably remember having like an old Sound Blaster card. Like my first 5.1 system when I went off to my freshman year of college, I had like one of those Sound Blaster USB cards with a bunch of like really small desktop speakers. And it also worked with headphones. But you probably remember like the Creative Sound Blaster had like a GUI like settings menu, and it had all these like EQ curves you could pick between. Like there was like the crystallizer button, there was like the opera house button. And I think these things were kind of like a pseudo process where you would put a stereo mix through it and it would just kind of add reverb to make it sound like you were in a different space. I don't think anything was happening as far as like, HRTF processing or any kind of like where you're taking a discrete multi-channel signal and then putting it through all these phase filters to make it compatible with headphones. So these creative cards were intended just to work with a discrete speaker system, be it either these 5.1 headphones from Turtle Beach or Corsair or whoever.
Yeah, I remember Creative used to make these headphones that had accelerometers, which basically kind of like gyroscopes. They track where your head is looking, and call what we call 3 degrees of freedom. That's just like rotation of your neck and looking up and down and tilting side to side. And I think this was like an early version of head tracking.
Yeah, and we should make a point to add that while my expertise may be in multi-channel music, you very much come from the world of like VR. So this is the first episode that's kind of more in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, so I find it really interesting that it seems like they've been trying to work on this system for a really long time. And I feel like the thing that really took off with it was all of the advancements in virtual reality technology. But that's something that we'll get into later in the podcast, so look forward to that. What I want to go over first was you told me earlier that the version of binaural that you get on Apple Music is actually different from other streaming services like Tidal and Amazon. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that is true. And that's, I think, something that's been causing a lot of consternation in the engineering community. So when you mix in Atmos using the Dolby renderer, which used to be a standalone application, but now it's built into most DAWs, you can select a headphone-only monitoring option. And that uses like the Dolby version of the binaural algorithm. And when you're mixing with objects in Atmos, you can assign them these binaural tags. The options are near, mid, far, and off. And these control kind of your perception of distance. So if you set something to far, it creates kind of like a stronger ambience around it. It's subtle, but it's effective. Now, the Apple system doesn't use any of this stuff. For spatial audio, they're essentially decoding to 714, and then they're putting the 714 into like a virtual room. And this is where things come in, like the head tracking feature. So I think the reason why they designed it this way is so they could add head tracking. But it creates issues when you're mixing because it throws out all that sort of extra binaural processing you can do to make the mix more convincing.
So Apple Music also has a spatializing function for stereo recordings. How does that compare with true binaural audio?
Yeah, this is kind of going back to like what we were saying about the creative system, how they had these like EQ profiles where they would just add reverb to things to make it sound like you were in a different space. Like, to my ears, all the Spatialized stereo really does is it just adds reverb to your stereo mix, and it makes it just kind of sound distant and like washy. I don't really like the effect at all, personally. So most of my binaural listening has been done using either AirPods Max or AirPods Pro, which use spatial audio. But you're one of the only people I know who has an Apple Vision Pro. So I'm curious, like, how is the Atmos experience with that? And is it different from using like the other Apple products that I mentioned?
I think the Vision Pro's binaural rendering is the best out of all of the Apple devices. So first of all, the Apple Vision Pro has some advantages in terms of listening to spatial audio. So you had mentioned that one of the things that really matters when you're trying to do binaural audio is this head transfer function, or the HRTF.
Yeah.
And that's only one component of it, right? So one thing is that they require an iPhone, and it has a LiDAR scanner that can scan 3D, and they use it to scan essentially a 3D model of your ear. And that's one component of it. And the Vision Pro takes this a step further, and as you walk around a room, it generates a 3D mesh of your actual environment. That's like the table sitting in front of you, your chair, the exact measurement of all your walls, and it makes these surfaces. And because the Vision Pro knows exactly where you are in a 3D space, I think that it's rendering this virtual room and these virtual sound sources much more accurately than if you were just wearing AirPods alone. In fact, there's a rumor that the next version of AirPods is going to have cameras on it, and this is to help with what's called 6 degree of freedom tracking. That's the ability to have your listening device know exactly where you are in your room. Say you have a square room, you walk to the left side of the room, and then you walk to the right side of the room. It'll know exactly where you are between those parts, right? And right now, the Vision Pro is the only device that can do this in terms of, and has the ability to do this like spatial audio with the ear scan and stuff.
Yeah, so we should touch on that briefly. That, like I was saying originally, Apple was using like a generic HRTF, and however good the spatial audio sounded to you was just however similar your own HRTF was to the generic profile they were using. But then in a recent update, they added this feature where you could take like a scan of your ear with the iPhone camera. And it's nowhere near as complex as having a real HRTF measurement. Like the actual thing would be like you go into a soundproof room and they scan your ear using this like very complex system. But it's nice to see that they're kind of on the right track in terms of implementing personalized spatial audio.
Yeah. And what I wanted to say was the Vision Pro definitely has different room environment EQ settings. So for example, like if I were to FaceTime call you with my Vision Pro, Jonathan, and I was in the forest environment, and then I switched it to a desert environment, and then I took myself out of it and back into my own room. Every time you talk to me in a different environment, your voice actually sounds different, and it matches the sound profile of the environment that you're in. And I think it's doing this because it knows essentially what environment you are in and has an idea of how to bounce the audio and what should be absorbing audio in these environments. And it's processing these in a way that sounds so much more accurate than if you were just to listen using AirPods and an iPhone. Unfortunately, it's a big buy-in to get into this, right?
Yes.
First of all, you need an iPhone to set up the personalized spatial audio to do the ear scan. And then you need a Vision Pro. And then you also need like AirPods or the latest Beats headphones or something like that. But when you get it all together, it's really, really good.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So one of the questions that I have going into this is like when it's doing what you say, like it's scanning your room and it's sort of factoring in the actual room acoustics rather than just using like the generic virtual room. Can you actually tell it like where to put the speakers?
Yeah, you can. So when you press the crown button on the Vision Pro, will do what's called the recentering. It'll recenter, like, it tells you what the center of your environment should be. So if you're in an environment that doesn't have walls, say you're on the moon or in a desert or something, you press the recenter button, it'll put you in the center of that VR space. But in addition to that, if you move the window, so remember this is VR, right? There's going to be a floating window. Wherever the window is going to be your center speaker. So if I move the window to my left, or if I walk around the window, I can actually hear the audio come from that point source.
So, like, say you're listening, like, to one of these mixes, like we talked about in the last episode, like the Steven Wilson mix of Grateful Dead American Beauty. Like, I know from listening to that on speakers that the center speaker just has the lead vocal and nothing else. So you're telling me that if you walk towards the floating icon of the Apple Music display with the Vision Pro, like, the vocal will actually get louder, like as if you're walking towards the center speaker.
Yes, that's exactly it.
Wow. So if the effect is really as impressive as you say, these Vision Pros, and I'm very curious to try them based on what you're telling me, would you rather listen with the Vision Pros than with an actual home theater?
That's a good question. So I've actually really been enjoying listening to all of our surround sound music in the Vision Pro. And I feel like it's because the virtual speakers that I'm getting out of it are a lot more balanced and in comparison to my real ones. And I like being able to not have to sit in like such a specific location and annoy my neighbors with my loudspeakers. Like, that's another thing. And I think like until I had a Vision Pro, like the surround sound never really felt like a real setup until I had the Vision Pro. Now I feel like it's comparable but this is also an interesting thing. So the way they tune each speaker, I think, is different from the way like a real speaker system would work, where like you have, for example, sometimes your center is like a smaller speaker, sometimes your center is like a bigger speaker, right? You have no control over what these speaker sizes are and how those are profiled in. I think it would be really cool if there was an app that lets you place speakers and adjust like warmness and tone of each speaker like in an environment. But and I looked through the documentation. I'm a programmer, of course. I'm IAA's lead developer. I looked through the documentation. There is a way to do this. You can actually tell in the app exactly where to put the audio sources for each channel, which is really nice. So I think like it is possible to do something like this down the line. I want to preface that since I'm a developer, my Vision Pro is always on the betas. So I don't know what they change between version to version and on release. So there's also a big overhaul coming up in June. So I'm hoping that they keep the audio as good as it has been. But this is a emerging technology, essentially. So my experience might be different from the current release, which is the non-beta version.
So, since we last talked, obviously you and I have gone over to Apple Music and IA Shop and listened to, as many songs as we can get our hands on in spatial audio and binaural. So, based on kind of your own experience, both with AirPods and with the Vision Pro, how do you think listening in binaural compares with speakers?
So, I feel like the plain binaural tracks that you sent to me that are representative of what you would get on Amazon Music or Tidal don't have the same acoustic profile as Apple Spatial Audio or when you listen to like it on real speakers. I feel like you get a better soundstage, more clarity in the direction of where the sound's coming from when you're listening to IA's tracks at like their full fidelity, essentially. I do notice how big of a difference it is when you get kind of these lossy versions of the surround sound tracks that you've sent me.
Yeah, so, my kind of take on this is that typically if you want like a real binaural effect, like if you want it to feel like the sounds are actually sort of extending beyond where the headphones end, which is what I as a listener would want. Typically, the more separation there is in the mix, the better it works. Which is interesting because, as you and I have found, a lot of popular records are mixed like with all the sounds in the front speakers and just like echoes in the other ones. And to mix for that in binaural, at least based on my listening experience, is about the worst translation you could get. It's the mixes that almost sound like a little too discreet on speakers. Like if there's a guitar like all the way in the right side speaker, or there's like a backing vocal like in the back left corner. Like those things on headphones do feel like you're getting something beyond the traditional stereo experience. But on the flip side, I also find that placement can affect not only like how perception, but also EQ and balance. So typically, like I tend to find that when something is placed in the rear speakers in a 714 setup, so not the side speakers, but the ones all the way in the back, those elements in headphones don't necessarily sound like they're all the way behind you. They just sound quieter. And if you put them in the rear height speakers, they sound even quieter than that. So, it's interesting because I noticed kind of early on that a lot of Atmos mixes don't really use those speakers at all. Like the dominant channels tend to be front height, and side. And I have no doubt that the reason for this is because of these balance issues in the binaural translation.
So how do you weigh those speaker experience against the headphone experience then?
Well, that's a great question, and it's one that I always ask whenever I'm interviewing a producer or engineer who's working with Atmos and spatial audio. Because that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Like, when you're mixing, you have to flip between speakers and headphones. But, like, what do you prioritize? Because like I was saying, sometimes if you place something in speakers and it sounds good, it doesn't necessarily work in binaural. In a perfect world, like, it would be great if we could always put the backing vocals in the rear speakers, or we could always put, like, any kind of, like, ethereal effect or reverb in the heights. But, like, when 90% of people are going to listen to the mix on headphones, you can't just like put a guitar solo in the back because it might sound too quiet in the headphones.
I wonder if that has anything to do with the proliferation of these soundbars that have virtual rear speakers, where it's like a 3.1 setup, and it has additional speakers on the top that's intended to bounce the rear heights off your ceiling. But they never quite sound the same as if you actually had rear speakers. And I feel like it's more common in living rooms for people to have the really nice front and side, but basically almost non-existent rears.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to like what we were talking about with 5.1 in the early 2000s. A lot of 5.1 systems had like big speakers in the front and kind of like smallish ones in the back. So I wonder if a lot of engineers at the time were thinking like, well, it's better to be safe than sorry. Like if people have these small speakers for the rear that have a limited frequency response, like I shouldn't put any important information in the back. And I think we're kind of seeing a version of that now with the headphones. But I think my opinion, especially for this niche that we operate in, like, customers of IAA are people who know all about spatial audio, very high knowledge level, and probably have a proper home theater to listen to these mixes. I think you shouldn't underestimate the audience. Like if you have the opportunity to mix in a full 714 environment, you should do what sounds good to you. I mean, obviously you should make sure like it sounds acceptable in binaural, but I think for a spatial mix, the speaker environment should still take precedence.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is also happening is that the technology is moving very quickly. Like Apple's constantly updating their algorithms, probably in a way that no one can see but can feel.
Yes.
And these mixers might have to be hitting a moving target. I know for one that Meta, who makes those like the Oculus VR headsets essentially, have been working on new technologies. One of their interesting technologies is called Acoustic Ray Tracing. And it's very similar to how graphics processors do global light illumination ray tracing, where they're measuring the reflection of light as it bounces off different surfaces to generate an accurate model of shadows and reflections. In acoustic ray tracing, what you're doing is you're setting up a position of audio, and then you're simulating how that audio bounces off your 3D environment and all of the surfaces. So like, how does it diffract around corners? How does it absorb into different materials? And I've done demos of this where like you put something in front of you and it sounds different, and then you move your hand away and you feel the difference as if you were to put like a sound absorbing board in front of you in real life. So I think like as technology becomes more accurate, we'll get a better representation of these real speakers. So I think I think if mixers can target the best audio experiences, it will sound better for a longer amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody wants these mixes to be future-proof. Like, we don't want to be in a situation where another 20 years from now, like, all these classic records are being remixed again in another format. Like, I think for those of us who, like we talked about in the last episode, who've bought the same album in stereo, quad, 5.1, and now Atmos, we're kind of hoping, like, Atmos will be the last format because, the whole idea of this object-based audio is that it's infinitely expandable. But my kind of main question for you to sort of wrap all this up is, like, what do you think are the kind of current shortcomings of these binaural processes?
So in terms of shortcomings, I think that a lot of the current, so like everything except for the Vision Pro, it doesn't match a real room acoustic. And it can't because, it would be unrealistic for most people to 3D scan their room, essentially. And I feel like Dolby's, I feel like there's virtualization of these like listening rooms, and you can feel the difference between like if you were to listen to an Apple TV spatial audio and then an iPhone and a Mac spatial audio, they're actually in different rooms. An Apple TV will render it in kind of more of a theater environment, which is like wider, where I noticed that your MacBook and your iPhone will render it in a smaller space, kind of like an office. So Dolby doesn't actually take those into account. I think they have like this reference room, essentially, that they're trying to render off of. And so that's one shortcoming. Another shortcoming is that, like as with any headphone, is that the bass response is going to not be as good as if you had like a real sub. You won't have that thump.
Yes.
And there's actually interesting ways around this. Skullcandy has these headphones. They're called their Crusher series of headphones. And what they do is they have vibration motors inside each ear cup that will vibrate along with the low frequencies of bass to give you that thump feeling. And I have to say that is so convincing. It works so well to emulate the feeling of having like a big sub next to your head. Another shortcoming is that without a proper measurement, an HRTF profile probably isn't going to work for everyone. And I think Apple does a good stopgap of measuring your ear, but like the only way to get it perfect is to really sit there in a proper room and get it calibrated, which there are some products that have really good HRTF calibration. Unfortunately, they're extremely expensive and hard to get, though.
Of course. So you're telling me that not only is Apple going to have a scan of all our earlobes, but they're also going to be able to scan like our living rooms too now.
Yeah, they're going to see where you can put your HomePods and if you're missing an iMac on your desk or something.
So they'll see you don't have an iMac, and then like the next day you'll get a mysterious email that there's like a sale on iMacs or something.
We're joking, of course. Apple's very privacy conscious, so I doubt they would ever do something like that. I'm excited for the technology that they're bringing to the table, because like we have all of these VR headsets from Valve and Meta and all of these things, and no one is focusing on like this other use, like this home office type of use, or where like you just want to sit back and listen to music. And I think that's kind of a shortcoming of some of these other products, whereas Apple is thinking about it in a different context. It's not just a gaming device. It's something that you would actually sit there and use. Like I use mine with a giant virtual screen. It's like an 8-foot wall, and it's super nice. And when I listen to music in it, like it really adds to the experience because, I don't have a huge Atmos setup in my office, but I can listen to Atmos music in my office now, which is very nice.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, we want people to be listening to Atmos music.
Yeah.
Like the system is not 714, it's Atmos. Like if it was only 714, there would be no chance of widespread adoption, even if that is the best way to listen to it. But anyway, on that note, we're going to have to take a short break. But when we come back, much like in the last episode, we're going to talk about some specific examples of tracks we listen to in Spatial and, how we think they translated based on the speaker mix.
This podcast is sponsored by Immersive Audio Album, your #1 online hub for all things surround and immersive music. On our website, you'll find album and equipment reviews, interviews with industry professionals, and a whole lot more. In our online shop, you'll find a large catalog of high-res digital downloads in 5.1 surround sound, Dolby Atmos, and RF3D. At IAA, we believe fans deserve to own their music in the highest quality possible.
Okay, so we're back after the break. So for this section of the episode, what I've done is I've selected 5 tracks from albums that we sell on IAA. And I've had you listen both to the Apple Spatial version, which you can play either on AirPods in spatial audio binaural or on speakers. And what I've also done is I've generated a Dolby binaural print using the ADM masters, which vendors submit to IAA, so I can create the true HD files that we sell. So it's a unique opportunity not only to compare speaker mix with the headphone mix, but also the 2 different binaural algorithms. So I hope you like these songs because you had to listen to them a bunch of times.
Once again, I had to listen to all of the tracks like so many times in so many different variations. But yeah, I did like the tracks that you sent over. And I think some of these are like IAA's top selling tracks.
Exactly. One of my favorites, of course, is the Vennart track, The Familiar, which is like a 15-minute single that was mixed by Steven Wilson. So we were very excited to get that up for sale back in February this year. So shout out to Mike Vennart if you're listening. So the reason why I picked these tracks is not only because there's a sort of variance of genres and mix approaches, but they were also like, if you were to look at the ADM Dolby Renderer display, you could see they were all mixed using like different philosophies. Like whether it's only with the bed or with like an object bed or with a combination of beds and objects. So obviously this stuff really isn't all that relevant because the end user doesn't know like how it was mixed. But it is interesting to compare how those different styles translate when you're moving between binaural and speakers. So the first track we're going to look at is Monkey House's new single, Someplace on Madison, which was released through Alma Records just last Friday. So Monkey House, if you're not familiar, they're like a jazz rock group kind of in the vein of Steely Dan. And this is the first single from their upcoming album, Crashbox, which is coming out on June 6th. So I think this mix sounds incredible on speakers. Like it's very much akin to continue the Steely Dan comparison to a lot of the Steely Dan and Donald Fagen mixes that Elliot Shiner did in 5.1 during the early 2000s, which are considered some of the best 5.1 mixes ever. So it's kind of like you have the main rhythm section in front of you, the lead vocals like mostly in the center channel, but also in the fronts. And then the side and back speakers are used for things like the backing vocals and horns. One thing I noticed, though, that was really strange, and I think it goes back to what I was saying before about how when you place things toward the rear, sometimes they just sound kind of darker and more buried on headphones, is that when you listen to it, especially using the Apple AirPods, like the horn blasts in the rear sound like very buried in the binaural. I'm curious if that was your experience as well.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You sent me different formats. So I had a lossy format and a lossless format, and I was listening to it on different devices, and each one sounded different. But I totally understand what you mean by it becoming lost.
So then the question becomes, say like you're mixing a song and you have this problem. Like, do you just make the horns louder? Like, does it make sense to have the horns be louder than you'd like them to be in speakers so they sound fine in headphones? I don't know. Personally, I think, which is probably what they did here, you should mix it so it sounds good on speakers. And the headphones, whatever compromises there are, like that's just kind of shortcomings of the binaural system.
I agree with you. And, one thing that I remember on my Yamaha receiver for my Atmos setup is that it has the ability to adjust like how loud the rear speakers are, for example. Like if you want to increase, like say you have maybe smaller ones in the back and you wanted to do some fine adjustment on, your bass response or your rear speaker or something like that, you can do it. But because binaural is set by essentially the vendor that you're listening from, like, or whatever headphones you have, they don't have the ability to do these adjustments, which I feel like could be another step in leveling up.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it's interesting how if you go back to the 70s, like with every successive generation of home theater gear, they've been taking away more features. So if you go back to like the old quad stuff in the 70s, like my old Marantz amp that I was talking about before, there's literally like if you want to control the balance between the front and back speakers, there's just a slider you move up and down. Like it's very easy to do. But on like these modern AVRs today, like to change the speaker balance, like you have to go through all these different settings menus and things.
Oh yeah, sometimes you even need a special remote in order to even access those settings.
Exactly. And with binaural, like there's nothing you can change. Like it's just baked in. So if anyone's listening to this who does like the spatial audio coding or works at Dolby, it would be great to have like individual speaker controls to play with.
Please give us our sliders back. Thank you.
So the next song we're going to talk about is The Hardest Cut by Spoon. So Spoon are a Texas rock band. This record was released through Matador Records in 2022. And it was mixed in Atmos by Jim Eno, who's the drummer in the band. To my knowledge, I think it's his only Atmos mix done to date. But I think this record is fantastic, and it's a good example of like how to do hard rock well in Atmos. Because as we talked about in the last episode, a lot of rock stuff kind of loses its punch when the individual parts are spread out too much. But I really like the balance they got on this one. And one thing that's interesting about it is if you look at the ADM, you could see it was mixed almost entirely using the bed. So that would mean the only active channels would be 7.1.2. But there are a couple things split out into objects, like the backing vocals during the chorus, and there's also these hand claps that run throughout the song. And I think those are mixed like pretty much exclusively to the rear heights. But one thing that is really interesting about this mix, and this continues what we were saying before about how sometimes things in the back can sound buried. If you listen to it on speakers, there's during the chorus, there's like a double-tracked vocal, the chorus refrain. And when you listen to it on speakers, those extra vocals in the rear height speakers are like almost a little too loud. Like I would say they're like maybe like a dB or two hotter than I'd like. But when you listen in headphones, the effect is just right.
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting that you mentioned that the rear heights sound too loud. And I think this depends on your setup. So my setup has rear speakers that reflect off the ceiling. But you actually have speakers in your ceiling.
That's correct, yeah.
Which most people can't do. And I can see how maybe it would sound louder for you. To me, it sounded fine. And I think it just entirely depends on your setup.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. But it is interesting to me how it sounds just right in the headphones. So I wonder if that was an example of like maybe they were checking the mix in headphones. And they were like, someone was like, I want to hear a little bit more of those backing vocals and just, push the fader up a little bit. But otherwise, I think this mix translates really well to headphones. One of my favorite parts in it is that the during the chorus, there are these like staccato rhythm guitars. And for the most part, the guitars are they're mixed mostly up front, but they're lifted a bit into the height speakers. So they're kind of all around you during the verse. And then during the chorus, they suddenly go like very isolated in the sides. And it's a great moment, like they just pop up like right next to you. And it works just as well in the headphones as it does on the speakers.
It makes me wonder if Dolby has a real reference room, because I tried looking for what Dolby's reference room would be, and I really couldn't find like a physical reference room.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess that's probably proprietary information.
If anyone knows if Dolby has a real reference room that we could listen in, please comment, reach out to us.
Yes. So moving on to another track, Here We Go Again, which is a duet between Ray Charles and Norah Jones. It was the first track on Ray Charles's Genius Loves Company album, which was his, of course, final studio album before he passed away. This album was nominated for the Immersive Grammy this year. It ended up losing to Peter Gabriel's I.O., which is also a great mix. But we were very excited to get this up for sale on the site back in September of this year. So the mix was done by Eric Schilling for the album's 20th anniversary. But when it first came out back in the early 2000s, there was also a 5.1 version that was mixed by Al Schmidt, who was the original recording engineer. So if you go on the site and you look back to the announcement blog, I did kind of a brief comparison between the 5.1 and the Atmos. They are pretty different. The Atmos mix is kind of a lot more aggressive with separating the individual instruments, which is something I generally like. Again, like I was saying before, like when you mix specific sounds into specific speakers, it usually works well with binaural. Like throughout this song, there's a rhythm guitar in the left side speaker, pretty much only in that speaker. And it does really sound like, when I'm listening on my AirPods Max, that it's floating outside the headphones. I don't know if you felt the same way.
Yeah, I think that it was the separation or the way they were able to get it sounded like it had a wider soundstage than what you get in stereo for sure.
Yeah, and another thing I noticed is that on this track, Billy Preston plays an organ solo. And in both the 5.1 and the Atmos mixes, the organ is mixed mostly to the rear, even when he's playing the solo, which is kind of cool. Like, that's very much kind of an old quad kind of thing to do, to mix solos to the back. It's something you don't typically see in modern surround mixes. But one thing I noticed, and I've picked up on this in other surround mixes, is when it comes to the back speakers, if something is mixed off-center, like if there's a loud, guitar, organ, backing vocal, whatever, and it's in like one of the corners, it sounds like it's like way over your shoulder, like as if you're listening to speakers. But if it's not quite all the way to one side, like if it's not hard panned or centered, in this case, the solo is mostly centered. It doesn't really feel like it's behind you at all in the headphones. And I think the reason for this is because of an issue with binaural called inside the head localization. Sometimes it happens also if there's like a lead vocal in the center channel, where sounds that are centered kind of lose their front-back effect, and they just kind of sound like they're in the middle of your head, as if you're listening to a regular stereo mix.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because as I was walking around my room in the Vision Pro, I didn't get this issue.
Oh, interesting. So maybe they've discovered the secret to fixing it.
Well, the secret is to is to 3D scan your room.
You really got to let me try those Vision Pros. Like the more I hear about this, I mean, I'm very intrigued. So the next track we're going to talk about is a big hit song, "To Be With You" by Mr. Big, which is from their classic 1991 album Lean Into It. Now, this was a very early Atmos mix. It was done, I think, in 2021. Like, if you remember when Spatial Audio first came out, it was on one of those like made for rock spatial audio playlists, like rock music in spatial audio. Listening to this, the first thing I picked up on is that like when the full band comes in, there's like a shaker mixed to the height speakers, and even in the headphones, it totally sounds like it's above you. At least for me, like I was like, for a second there, I was like, whoa. Like I sort of forgot I was listening on headphones. But the other part of that is I had listened to it in 7.1.4 before, so I knew what to expect. So I don't know if there's like sort of a confirmation bias that happens when you're listening to binaural and you already know how things are placed on speakers. But one thing about this track that kind of screams like early spatial audio is there's this part at the very end where the vocal starts to pan around the room. I mean, it sounds cool on the headphones, and it's a good demo of like when you're moving an individual point source around the speakers, but I did think it was sort of gimmicky. I don't know what you thought about that.
I like the gimmick stuff. I think if you're going to have all of these speakers around you, or have a system that can 3D move things around, use it. Make me dizzy.
Just like in the Pink Floyd track, right? With the cash registers.
It's okay. It's like, I think it's fun. And it's not like you're going to listen to this song like on a single loop forever. So, every now and again, I think it's fun to have the gimmick.
But yeah, I would say for sure, like if anyone wants to hear like an effective demo of binaural, like definitely listen to the last like minute or so of this song. And the last track we'll talk about, which I alluded to briefly earlier, was the new Vennart single, The Familiar, which is really more of an EP than a song because it's like 15 minutes. But this track, of course, was mixed by Steven Wilson. To this day, it's the only thing we have mixed by him that's up on IAA. Though we did have the December Skies Christmas single up for a limited time. So I don't know if anyone listening picked that up. But if I thought the Mr. Big track was like an example of like movement done in kind of a gimmicky way, I think it's done perfectly in this track. And there are parts where you can tell there are different things moving at ground level versus in the heights. Like throughout the whole song, there's like this sustainy guitar effect that's constantly swirling around the height speakers. And it totally works because in the stereo mix, it's also moving around. And another cool thing in the song, and this is kind of relating to what I was saying about the organ solo in the Ray Charles track, There's this part at the very end where the track ends on like this repeating like grungy guitar riff, and the riff moves back and forth across the front and back speakers. So it moves like from the front through the sides to the back, and then the other way around, back and forth again for about a minute or so. And on speakers, it sounds like really trippy because you could feel like the guitar moving through you. When you listen to it on headphones, it doesn't quite sound like it's moving in front of you and behind you, but you can feel it getting like narrower and wider. So I don't know if that was like necessarily the intention, but it sounds trippy on headphones.
I really like the front to back movement in Spatial. And this is not the only song that does it. I think one of the songs from our prior session also had a part that they do back to front. And I think that's a really cool effect.
Yeah, I mean, there's all these different combinations you could do. You could do back to front. You could do like diagonals. Like you could have a sound moving from, front left to rear right. Of course, when people think of surround, they always think of things moving in a circle. But there's all these different combinations you can do that can be interesting depending on, whether they fit within the song and they work with the arrangement. So, it's sort of tricky to tie this all up onto, a unifying conclusion. But my take on binaural is that it's not really comparable with speakers based on the equipment I've used. Based on what you're telling me about the Apple Vision Pro, that may no longer be true. And there may finally be something out there that is analogous to speakers. But even if it's not as effective, it's still interesting in its own right. And it's still better than stereo.
Yeah, I agree. It's different than speakers, but it's still a good listening experience. I still think it's better than stereo, as you were saying. Like whether it's music or a movie or a game, I always prefer listening to it in like Dolby or in Spatial. I think as time and technology moves forward, I'm hoping that binaural rendering gets better and more closer to the speaker experience. But I think there are going to be a couple more hurdles to jump over before we can get there.
Based on what you're telling me about like the idea of like, replicating sub content by like attaching some kind of like haptic device to your chest, like we're headed for this like Ready Player One world where people are just going to be like walking around in the streets wearing binaural helmets, like walking into walls.
Yeah, those ANC Crusher headphones, you should definitely give those a try. The audio quality, it's not the best. It's not the best headphones I listen to, but the bass quality is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if when you're listening in Spatial, like if it knows to send the like actual LFE channel to that device, or if there's some kind of like bass management process going on.
I haven't tried those specific headphones with Spatial, mainly because they broke. The plastic in them isn't very good.
Well, if anyone listening, if you want to give your thoughts in the comments or just tell us what your favorite, binaural mixes are on Apple Music or Tidal or Amazon, or of course on IAA, let us know because we're interested to hear what the community thinks.
Also tell us what you're listening on. I'm very curious to see if anyone's listening to binaural that's not on like AirPods or AirPod Maxes or something.
And does anyone else have a Vision Pro, or is Cameron like the only person on the Western Seaboard that has one?
Yeah, I'm one of the 11 people that bought it on launch day at full price.
Wow. All right, well, thanks everyone for listening.